This student has a decent computer, a quiet place to study, and of course, high-speed internet. They're indispensable, especially now that schools and universities in Chile have been closed for months, and classes as well as assignments are all online. But for 47% of Chileans, these are luxuries well beyond their reach. On the eve of a total lockdown in Chile's capital, we followed Maria Alicia Cordero and her son Dylan to an internet cafe that's been their salvation. Here they look up information for Dylan's homework and print out the assignments they'll need to later email to the teacher. Back at home, they explain that even that will now be impossible because the internet cafe can't open under lockdown.
We only have one mobile phone with a very limited internet plan, and it's not good enough to watch classes online. The connection always fails.
They share the same phone. Maria Alicia, who has two other small children, was attending night school to finish her studies. But with no money for internet or a computer, what was difficult before is now hopeless, she says.
I told my teacher that I'd better leave my space to someone else who has the means to keep up with the curriculum and exams online.
Chile has first-world digital technology, but only if you can afford it. 90% of the students at this university rely on government loans or scholarships, and now they risk losing them if they cannot keep up with their courses online. Law student Camila Riquelme explains why, even though her campus is closed, students have decided to go on strike.
We wanted to make the digital divide visible. We're asking that the state guarantee a constitutional right, which is education. And today, education is impossible without access to internet.
Congress has in fact just passed a bill that would oblige internet companies to provide free service to all students who receive government help, which are the majority, while the pandemic lasts.
Through no fault of their own, simply because they're poor, and this unveils the reality of the crisis we are living through that has a strong social impact.
It's a social fault line that, with the pandemic, is highlighting growing demands for digital rights to be considered a human right. Lucia, Newman, Jazeera, Santiago.
Now, further to this, there is a new report on the effects of coronavirus on education. It comes from the UN body UNESCO, which says 40% of the world's low and lower middle income countries have not supported disadvantaged students during the global shutdown of schools. So over 90% of the global student population is affected by coronavirus-related school closures, most of them in sub-Saharan Africa. UNESCO says half of the world's out-of-school children were in this region even before the pandemic began. In the Middle East, 17 million young people are missing out on an education. UNESCO blames it on governments failing to ensure that poorer students have access to learning during lockdown. While in Central and Southern Asia, 95 million children are not getting an education. MANOS Antoninis is the director of UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report. He's on Skype from Paris today. Thank you for your time. I note that line in the report where UNESCO talks about governments failing to ensure that poorer students have access to learning. What could they have done? What should they have done?
Well, it is not a very easy challenge for them. To some extent, countries did not expect this onslaught. So the 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report was in fact looking on the theme of inclusion in education, which is a commitment that countries made in 2015 to achieve by 2030. Countries do not know exactly what inclusion means. They often associate it with one group. But this crisis, this health crisis, showed very clearly that inclusion challenges and inequalities can affect any learner. And the poorest countries did face themselves with an impossible challenge. Your report was excellent. It was describing the challenges that poorer people in a high-income country like Chile are facing. However, in low and middle-income countries, access to the internet is really very limited. In the least developed countries, only 12%. Even access to radio and television can be very, very complicated for those countries that experimented with those means. In countries like the DRC or Ethiopia or Kenya even, the poorest households do not have television. Only 7% of the poorest households in Ethiopia have a radio. Therefore, for hundreds of millions of students around the world, continuation of education is an impossible task for any government.
So tell me then, how could those countries have done something? If, and you rightly point out, internet access, even TV and radio access, that can be a major hindrance. So what would remote or distance learning have looked like in the countries we're talking about?
I think it's fair to say that unlike often many quite optimistic and enthusiastic reports about the opportunities that this crisis gave to countries, we should be a little bit more cautious because, as I think I explained before, the government's hands are tied, and with all these restrictions on the possibility to interact and have contact, most of these solutions are very poor substitutes for education. The main challenge is what governments are going to be doing once schools start to reopen. And this is where we need particular attention from the international community.
Was education always, sorry, Manos, was education always going to be something that fell by the wayside, that got ignored? When an emergency like this comes along and the focus went into lockdowns, into social distancing and into healthcare and testing and looking after people who were sick, unfortunately, education slipped down the rankings a bit.
Well, it shouldn't be, and that's a major mistake, because any society that has ignored education and has fallen behind is actually going to find this challenge to it even very soon. Education is first and foremost a right for all, and that's what our report is stressing. But it's also an investment. If you ignore the education now, a few years later, you will pay that back in terms of lower growth rates and lower opportunities for young people, more frustrations and more social challenges down the way. Education cannot wait at any moment, even at the worst of crisis.
Yeah, big picture always to look at, isn't there? Manos Antoninis is from UNESCO's Global Education Monitoring Report. Thank you, Manos.
Thank you.